Hey everyone, this is Taehyung. I know it's been a while since I've sat down like this, just me, a mic, and the quiet hum of the room. No lights, no stage, no script, just me. And I think it's time I talk about something I've kept to myself for far too long. Something that's been sitting heavy on my chest. This isn't a statement, it's not a press release. It's a story, a piece of my life I never thought I'd have to explain, but maybe some of you need to hear it because maybe someone out there has gone through the same thing, wanting to build a new life but being pulled back by the past. I'm talking about my dad and how he said no to the most important day of my life, my wedding, because of someone I used to love. When I first told my parents I wanted to get married, I expected surprise, maybe even a few tears. But I didn't expect silence. That kind of silence that fills a room like cold smoke where you can't breathe and every second feels like forever. My mom smiled a little. She said she was happy if I was happy. But my dad, he just looked at me and then he said no. At first, I thought I heard him wrong. No? To what exactly? He said it again. No, Taehyung, you can't marry her. And it wasn't anger in his voice. It was something deeper, something tired, something afraid. I wanted to ask why, but before I could, he said, because of what happened last time. That hit me harder than I expected because last time was a long time ago and I thought we'd all moved on from it. But I guess parents don't forget the things that broke their children. He was talking about my ex, the one who changed everything. It's strange, isn't it? How one person can walk into your life and completely rewrite the way your family sees you. How a heartbreak can echo for years even when you've healed. I remember those days. I was younger, more reckless. I thought love meant fighting the world for someone, even if that meant losing myself. And maybe my dad watched me crumble more than I realized. Maybe he saw how I shut down, how I stopped eating, stopped singing, stopped laughing. And now, years later, when I finally found someone who made me feel alive again, he couldn't separate that new love from the old pain. I told him, Dad, she's not her. This is different. He just shook his head. Pain doesn't care who caused it, son. It only remembers what it felt like. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking, how can the person who raised me, who taught me about love, be the one to stand in my way of it? But maybe that's what love looks like to him. Maybe he's not trying to stop me from being happy. Maybe he's trying to stop me from being hurt. Still, it hurt because all I wanted was for him to see me not the boy who made mistakes, but the man who learned from them. I sat alone in my room that night, staring at the engagement ring. It looked like hope and fear, both shining under the same light. And I thought about what it meant to love someone so much that you'd fight your own family for them. I know some people might say, you're an adult, just do it, get married anyway. But in my family, things aren't that simple. Love isn't rebellion, it's respect. And even when it breaks you, you don't turn your back on the people who raised you. The next morning, my mom came into my room. She didn't say much. She just sat beside me and handed me a cup of coffee. Then she said quietly, Your dad's heart is complicated, Taehyung. He's protecting you the only way he knows how. I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I understood Still, I couldn't accept that the shadow of my ex would haunt my future. That every smile I had with my fiancé would carry the ghost of someone I used to love. I didn't want that. Not for me, not for her, not for my family. So I decided I would talk to him again. But this time, not as a son begging for approval, as a man asking to be understood. Before I went to see him, I thought about everything, all the years he worked so hard to give me the life I wanted. All the nights he came home too tired to talk but still asked, "Did you eat?" All the silent ways he showed love. And I realized maybe this isn't about control or judgment. Maybe this is about a father who lost sleep every night watching his son's heart fall apart once and never wanted to see it happen again. When I walked into his room, he was sitting by the window reading something. I said, "Dad, can we talk?" He nodded. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then I told him everything about how I met her, about how she made me calmer, steadier, happier, about how she taught me what peace feels like. He listened quietly, not interrupting even once. And when I finished, he sighed. He said, "Taehyung, love makes you soft, but life doesn't care about softness." I smiled, even though my chest ached. "Then I'll protect her with strength, not with softness," I said. He didn't answer, just looked at me the same way he did when I was 5 and told him I wanted to be a singer. The same eyes, the same silence before a storm of pride or fear. And I realized something in that moment. He wasn't refusing me because he didn't believe in love. He was refusing because he didn't believe in me, not yet. And that broke me in a way no heartbreak ever had. But maybe that's where growth begins, not when others believe in you, but when you finally decide to believe in yourself. I left his room with a quiet mind. No shouting, no tears, just silence and a strange sense of peace. Because for the first time, I understood my dad, and even though he still hadn't said yes, I knew the answer wasn't really no either. It was just not yet. The next few days felt like walking through fog. Everything looked familiar, but nothing felt the same. My mom tried to keep things normal. She'd cook my favorite meals, ask about my schedule, but I could feel it in her eyes. She was worried, not about the wedding, not even about my dad. She was worried about me. I started avoiding home for a bit, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know how to act around them. Every dinner table felt heavier, every silence stretched longer than it should. And the crazy thing is, I still loved them both more than anything. That's what made it all so confusing. My fiancée noticed it too. She didn't say much at first, but one evening she asked me, "Are you sure you're okay marrying me if your dad doesn't approve?" I wanted to say, "Of course," without hesitation. But instead, I froze. Because deep down, I wasn't sure. Not because I doubted her, but because I couldn't stand the thought of walking down the aisle knowing my father wouldn't be there. That image haunted me. An empty chair in the front row, and me pretending it didn't matter. I guess that's when I realized that approval isn't about needing permission, it's about wanting peace. I didn't need his blessing to get married. I just needed his heart to be at peace with my choice. A few nights later, I decided to visit someone I hadn't seen in a while. Someone who knew both sides of the story, my older brother. He's always been the quiet type, the one who listens more than he talks. We sat at a cafe near the Han River, and as soon as he saw me, he said, "Let me guess you're here because of Dad." I laughed. "You always know." He took a sip of coffee and said, "He's scared, Taehyung. You know how he is. He doesn't say what he feels. He protects by controlling." I nodded. "Yeah, but I'm not a kid anymore. I need him to see that." "He knows that," my brother said, "but he also remembers what happened before. You fell apart, and it scared him. It scared all of us." I looked down. I didn't want to remember those days, but they were still there, buried but breathing. The breakup, the panic attacks, the way I stopped answering calls for weeks. I thought I was fine now, but maybe my dad never believed I really healed. My brother leaned back and said, "You want him to trust you again? Then show him you're not the same person." That hit me because I realized I'd been telling my dad to trust me instead of showing him why he should. That night, I went home and pulled out an old notebook from when I was a trainee. Inside were pages of lyrics raw, messy, emotional. Most of them were about love, heartbreak, and fear. But there was one page that caught my eye. A line I had written years ago. "Love is not about finding someone new, it's about becoming someone new." I smiled a little. Maybe it was time I started living that line. So I began to make changes, not dramatic ones, but quiet ones. I stopped avoiding home. I started talking to my dad more, not about the wedding, but about simple things. Football, his garden, music. At first, he barely responded, but over time, I noticed he was starting to listen again. One afternoon, I found him in the backyard trimming the hedges. I grabbed another pair of shears and started helping. We didn't talk, but there was something healing about the silence. The way two people who loved each other but didn't know how to say it could still share the same space. When we finished, he looked at me and said quietly, "You're calmer these days." I smiled. "I'm trying to be." He nodded once, then went back to trimming. That was his version of a compliment. A week later, he asked, "So, how is she?" It was the first time he had brought her up, and that simple question felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. I told him about her job, her laugh, the way she always insists on feeding stray cat. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. Then he said, "She sounds kind." I looked at him and said, "She is." And for the first time, I saw something soften in his face, something that looked a lot like acceptance. But I knew it wasn't over yet. I could feel there was still something he hadn't said, something that weighed on him. That night, after dinner, he called me into his study. I remember his words like they were carved into my memory. "Taehyung, love isn't easy for men like us. We love deeply, but we hide it behind pride. When your heart broke before, it broke me too, and I don't want to see that again." I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, trying not to cry, because I finally understood that his no wasn't rejection, it was fear. Fear of seeing his son in pain again. I walked up to him and said, "Dad, I can't promise I'll never get hurt again, but I can promise I'll never give up when things get hard. He looked up at me for a long moment, and then just barely he smiled. Then maybe he said, "You're ready." It wasn't a full approval, but it wasn't a refusal anymore. It was something in between an open door. And sometimes that's all a man needs. Not a perfect yes, but a sign that someone's finally willing to believe in him again. As I left his study, my mom was waiting outside the door. She looked at me with that soft smile only moms have and said, "See, his heart just needed time." I nodded, but inside I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Because while my dad was starting to open up, someone else from my past was about to return and test everything I just built. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was in the studio working on some music when my phone lit up with the message I never expected to see again. A name that once made my heart race, but now it just made my hands go cold. It was her, my ex. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. My first instinct was to ignore it, pretend it never happened. But curiosity mixed with something deeper, something unfinished, made me open it. "Hi Taehyung, I heard you're getting married. Congratulations." Just a simple text. Polite, distant. But beneath those words, I could feel the weight of everything we'd been through. I didn't reply. Not because I hated her, but because I didn't trust myself to say the right thing. Sometimes silence is the only safe answer. But later that night, I found myself thinking about her anyway. Not in a romantic way, more like revisiting an old scar. You don't miss the pain, but you can still feel where it once lived. A few days passed and I thought it was over. But then, somehow, my dad found out she had texted me. I don't even know how. Maybe my mom mentioned it without realizing it would matter. All I know is, the moment I walked into the living room, his face said it all. "So she reached out, huh?" he said, his voice flat. I sighed. "Yeah, but it was nothing, Dad. She just wanted to say congratulations." He looked at me, his jaw tightening. "And you think that means nothing?" I stayed silent. He stood up and said, "This is exactly what I was afraid of. The past doesn't disappear just because you pretend it's over." For a moment, I felt like the air was sucked out of the room. I wanted to yell, to tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't that wicked anymore. But instead, I said quietly, "She's part of my past. That's all." He shook his head. "The past only stays in the past if you stop opening the door for it." His words cut deep because even though I hadn't replied to her message, I had opened it. And maybe that was enough. That night, I sat in my car outside my fiance's apartment. She came down smiling, holding 2 cups of coffee. But the moment she saw my face, the smile faded. "What happened?" she asked. I told her everything about the message, about my dad's reaction, about how I didn't even know why it was bothering me so much. She listened quietly, and then she said something I didn't expect. "Do you still feel guilty about her?" The question hit like lightning. Because guilt, yeah, that was the word I'd been avoiding. I took a long breath. "I don't know. Maybe part of me does. Not because I miss her, but because I know I wasn't perfect back then. I made mistakes." She nodded slowly. "And maybe that's what your dad sees." He doesn't see her. He sees the version of you that was broken. That made sense in a way I hadn't thought about. Maybe this wasn't about her at all. Maybe it was about me, my dad's memory of who I used to be. A few weeks went by, and I focused on wedding preparations. But the message still sat there on my phone, unreplied, unread again, yet somehow alive. A reminder of everything I thought I'd buried. Then, one afternoon, while we were picking out decorations, my phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, it wasn't her, it was one of our mutual friends. They said she had gone through something difficult and that she'd mentioned missing the way I used to make her feel safe. That's when the guilt started creeping back in again. Because no matter how far I'd come, part of me still cared about people who had hurt me. Not because I wanted them back, but because I never wanted anyone to feel abandoned. And maybe that's what made things worse. Because that night, while I was scrolling through old music files, I found a song I wrote years ago about her. A song that was never released, never finished. Listening to it again felt strange. It wasn't sadness, it was closure I didn't know I needed. I thought about deleting it, but something stopped me. Instead, I saved it again, this time under a new title, Forgiveness. The next day, I went to see my dad again. I didn't tell him about the message or the song. Instead, I told him something simpler. Dad, I think I finally understand what you meant. He looked up from his newspaper. About what? About how love isn't just about moving on, it's about letting go without hate. He studied my face for a while, then nodded. That's a hard thing to learn, son. Yeah, I said, but I think I'm learning. He smiled faintly, then said something that stayed with me. Good, because real love starts when the ghosts stop running your life. For the first time, I felt a weight lift off my chest. Not because everything was fixed, but because I finally saw the full picture. It wasn't just about getting his approval or escaping the past. It was about finding peace with all the versions of myself that had loved, lost, and grown. That weekend, my fiancé and I visited my parents for dinner. The atmosphere was warmer this time. My dad even asked her questions where she grew up, what her parents were like, how we met. She answered with her gentle smile, and I could see my dad slowly softening moment by moment. After dinner, he pulled me aside. She's strong, he said quietly, stronger than I expected. I nodded. She is. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw pride in his eyes. Maybe he finally believed me. Or maybe he just saw that I wasn't afraid anymore. But just when I thought everything was finally settling down, life had one more test waiting for me. Because a few days later, I received a call that changed everything. It was from my ex's mother, and her voice was trembling when she said, Taehyung, can you come? She's in the hospital. When I heard her mother's voice shaking on the phone, I froze. It felt like all the air in the room disappeared. I hadn't spoken to her family in years, but the tone in her mother's voice wasn't something you could ignore. She's in the hospital, she said again. She's not doing well. She asked to see you. For a few seconds, I couldn't say anything. Every rational part of me screamed no. I was engaged now. My life was finally moving forward. But the part of me that remembered who she used to be, the one who laughed at my worst jokes, who believed in me when no one else did that part, couldn't just hang up. So I went. I didn't tell my fiancé right away. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't know how to explain it yet. How do you tell the person you love that you're going to visit someone who broke your heart and almost broke you too? The drive to the hospital felt endless. The sky was gray, heavy with rain, like it already knew something painful was waiting for me. When I walked into her room, time stopped. She looked so different. Thinner, quieter, but when she saw me, she smiled weakly. Taehyung, you came. I just nodded. Yeah, how could I not? For a while, neither of us spoke. There was too much history in the air, too many unspoken words floating between us. Finally, she broke the silence. I didn't call to make things complicated. I just wanted to apologize. I frowned. Apologize? For what? For everything, for not understanding you, for walking away when you needed someone the most. Her voice cracked, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. I thought I was doing the right thing back then, but I was selfish and I hurt you. I sat down beside her bed and sighed. We both hurt each other. It wasn't just you. She smiled faintly. You were always like that, never blaming anyone fully, always carrying half the weight that wasn't yours. That line hit me harder than I expected. Because maybe she was right. Maybe I did carry too much for people who had already left. We talked for a while about life, about how things had changed. She told me she had been battling something for months but didn't want anyone to know. She said she wasn't afraid of dying, just afraid of being forgotten. That's when it hit me. Maybe that was why she reached out before. Maybe congratulations wasn't just about my wedding, it was her way of saying goodbye. Before I left, she held my hand and whispered, Please don't hate me, Taehyung. I want to know that you found peace. I squeezed her hand gently. I don't hate you. I just hope you find peace too. And with that, I walked out. The rain had started by the time I reached the parking lot. Cold drops mixed with the heat of my skin, and I didn't know if I was crying or if it was just the rain. Everything felt like a blur. The memories, the pain, the strange calm that came after. When I got home, my fiancée was waiting for me. Her eyes said she already knew. You went to see her, didn't you? I nodded slowly. Yeah. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just looked at me quietly. I understand, she said after a long pause. Sometimes closure doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from facing what still hurts. That's when I realized how lucky I was. Not just because she trusted me, but because she understood me in ways no one else ever had. Later that night, I told my dad everything, every detail, every emotion. He sat there in silence, listening, his face unreadable. When I finished, I asked, Was I wrong to go? He leaned back and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, No, son, you weren't wrong. But now you have to ask yourself, did you go there for her or for yourself? That question stuck in my head for days. I thought about it while working, while eating, even while lying awake at night. And the more I thought, the more I realized maybe it was both. A few weeks later, I received another call. This time, it wasn't her mother. It was a mutual friend. She passed away last night. For a moment, I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. It felt like the world went silent, not because I still loved her, but because a piece of my youth, of who I used to be, was suddenly gone forever. That night, I sat in my room with my guitar. I played the song I had renamed Forgiveness, but this time I finished it. Every lyric, every note, every quiet breath between chords, and when it was done, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The next day, I told my dad I was ready to move on. Truly move on. He smiled, that same small, quiet smile that only he could give. You did what you had to do, he said. And now you understand why I said no. I wasn't protecting you from her. I was protecting you from the version of yourself that didn't know how to let go. That line broke me and healed me at the same time. I finally understood. All his resistance, all his concern, it wasn't about control. It was about love. A father's love that saw danger where I only saw desire. And this time, when I looked at my fiancée, I didn't see her as the woman I was choosing over someone else. I saw her as the woman I was choosing with everything I had learned. Not as an escape from the past, but as the start of a future built from honesty, forgiveness, and peace. The morning after I found out she was gone, everything felt different. The world was quieter. Even the sound of the birds outside my window felt distant, like they were mourning too. I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. It wasn't grief, the way people expect. It was more like a soft ache, a realization that a story I once lived was now completely closed. There would be no more apologies, no more second chances, only memories. Later that day, my dad came into my room. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside me, the way he used to when I was a kid who didn't know how to deal with loss. After a long silence, he said quietly, "You look more peaceful today." I turned to him, surprised. "Peaceful?" She just, "I know," he said, nodding. "But peace doesn't mean the absence of sadness. It means you finally stopped fighting what you can't change." That hit hard, because for years I had been fighting everything: my past, my feelings, even my dad's advice. And now, for the first time, I wasn't fighting anymore. I looked at him and asked, "Dad, were you ever scared that I'd make the same mistakes again?" He smiled softly. "Every parent is scared of that. But I also knew you'd have to fall a few times before you learn how to stand for real." That conversation changed everything between us. For years, our bond had been strained, filled with quiet judgment and unspoken disappointment. But that day, it felt like we finally understood each other. Not as father and son, but as two men who had both loved and lost. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into preparing for the wedding. But something inside me had shifted. I didn't just want a perfect ceremony, I wanted it to mean something, something real. So one night, I called my fiancée and said, "There's something I want to do before we get married." She sounded curious. "What is it?" "I want to visit my ex's hometown, just once, to pay my respects and to say goodbye properly." There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "I'll come with you." When we arrived, it was a small, quiet town, the kind of place where time moves slower. We brought white lilies, her favorite flowers. Standing there, Looking at her name carved in stone, I felt an overwhelming mix of sadness and gratitude. I whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to love even if it hurt." My fiancée stood beside me holding my hand. No jealousy, no resentment, just understanding. She said quietly, "You can't start a forever with half a heart. I'm glad you came here." That's when I knew this was the woman I was meant to marry. Not because she was perfect, but because she saw every scar, every chapter, and still chose to stay. When we got back home, I called my dad. "I went to see her," I said. "It felt right." He was quiet for a moment before replying, "I'm proud of you, son. You finally learned what love really means." "What do you mean?" I asked. He said, "Love isn't about who you hold on to. It's about who you can let go of without losing yourself." Those words stayed with me. A week later, it was time for the wedding rehearsal. The music, the lights, the laughter, everything felt surreal. But right before we started, I pulled my dad aside. "Dad," I said, "I know you had your doubts at first, but I need you to know I'm not the same person anymore, and I'm not marrying her to prove anything. I'm marrying her because she's peace after the storm." He looked at me for a long moment, then placed a hand on my shoulder. "Then go and live that peace, son. Don't chase what's gone. Protect what's here." That night, before sleeping, I opened my phone again. The message from my ex, the one I never replied to, was still there. I read it one last time, then deleted it. Not out of anger, but because I didn't need it anymore. It felt symbolic, like closing the last door I'd been too scared to shut. The next morning, I woke up lighter. The sun was bright, the world loud again. And when I looked in the mirror, I finally saw myself, not the version shaped by guilt or memory, but the man I had become through it all. The day before the wedding, my dad surprised me. He came into my room holding a small box. "I've been saving this," he said, handing it to me. "Your grandfather gave it to me when I got married. He said it was for when I was ready to build something that would last." Inside the box was an old silver ring, simple but meaningful. I could see the faint engraving on the inside, "Forgive and begin." I looked up at my dad, and for the first time in a long time, I hugged him. No words, just a quiet, honest moment between two men who had finally made peace with everything that once tore them apart. The night before the wedding, I sat alone in my room holding my guitar, and I played Forgiveness one last time. Not for her, not for my dad, but for me, because I finally understood. Sometimes love doesn't end in happily ever after. Sometimes it ends in understanding, and that's enough. And as the last note faded, I whispered to myself, "Thank you for saying no, Dad, because your no led me to the right yes." The morning of the wedding felt unreal. The air was crisp, the sky a soft shade of gold, and yet everything inside me was trembling, not from fear, but from gratitude. As I stood in front of the mirror, fixing my tie, I caught a glimpse of the person staring back at me. He wasn't the boy who once begged for approval. He wasn't the man haunted by an ex or by mistakes. He was someone new, someone finally whole. A knock came at the door. It was my dad. For a second, neither of us said anything. We just looked at each other, two men carrying generations of unspoken words. "You look good," he said finally. "Thanks." I smiled. "I learned from you." He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, you didn't. You learned despite me. That made me laugh. But then he added, more softly, and I'm glad you did, son. For the first time, I saw emotion in his eyes, not the stern look of a father trying to protect his son, but the warmth of a man who finally realized his boy had grown up. He handed me the silver ring, the one from my grandfather, and said, remember what's written inside. Forgive and begin. That's the only way marriage survives. I nodded, trying not to tear up. When it was time to walk down the aisle, the music started, soft piano notes floating through the air like a memory coming alive. I looked around, and every face I loved was there. My bandmates, my friends, my mom, all smiling. And then I saw her, my bride, the woman who saw me not for my fame, not for my past, but for the quiet man beneath it all. She walked toward me, graceful, radiant. In that moment, the world slowed down. Every regret, every wound, every painful memory, they all blurred away, leaving only this one truth. I had made it here, through everything. When she finally stood in front of me, she smiled and whispered, you okay? I nodded, better than ever. The ceremony began. The priest spoke about love, about trust, about choosing each other every day even when it's hard. And when it was time for the vows, I took a deep breath